June 19, 1944, Philippine Sea, 40 miles west of Guam. Commander David McCampbell squinted through the plexiglass canopy of his F6F Hellcat, watching the morning sun climb over the Pacific. The ocean below stretched endlessly, a sheet of hammered silver broken only by the trace, wakes of 70 American warships. His radio crackled with the calm voices of radar operators deep inside the carrier Essex, tracking something massive moving toward them from the west. Raid incoming. Bearing 260. Range 130 miles. Multiple bogeys. Estimate 60 plus. McCampbell felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from anticipation. Below him, 15 carriers of Task Force 58 steamed in perfect formation, their decks packed with aircraft that represented the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. And heading directly toward them was the Japanese mobile fleet, launching everything it had in a desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion of Saipan. Within the next 11 minutes, the sky would become a killing field unlike anything naval aviation had ever witnessed. The Japanese pilots approaching in their Mitsubishi Zeros and Nakajima bombers had been told that American fighters were slow, clumsy, and piloted by men too soft for real combat. Their commanders had laughed at intelligence reports describing the F6F Hellcat, dismissing it as just another mediocre American design, heavier and less maneuverable than the Zero. They were flying into a trap built from 2 years of bitter lessons, captured aircraft analysis, and American industrial might. Before the sun reached its zenith, 72 Japanese aircraft would fall from the sky in just 11 minutes of sustained slaughter. The myth of Zero superiority would die with them. The transformation that made this massacre possible began not in 1944, but 2 years earlier, when American naval aviation was on its knees, struggling to survive against an enemy that seemed invincible in the air. December 7, 1941, had shattered American confidence. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese Zeros had swept American aircraft from Hawaiian skies with contemptuous ease. In the Philippines, they destroyed General Douglas MacArthur's Air Force on the ground. Across the Pacific, Zero fighters dominated every engagement, outturning, outclimbing, and outlasting every American fighter that dared challenge them. American pilots, flying obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and even the relatively modern Grumman F4F Wildcats, found themselves consistently beaten. The Zero could turn inside the Wildcat's turning radius, climb faster, fly farther, and fight longer. Early combat reports from the Pacific read like horror stories, Zeros appearing from nowhere, shredding American formations, then disappearing before anyone could respond. The official American tactical doctrine by early 1942 was humiliating in its simplicity. When engaged by Zeros, run away. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The psychological impact was devastating. American pilots developed what intelligence officers termed zero shock, a paralyzing respect for Japanese fighters that bordered on fear. They knew that in a turning fight, the Zero would win. They knew that if caught alone, survival was unlikely. They knew that Japanese pilots, many of them veterans with thousands of hours of combat, experience gained in China, possessed skills that American training programs could not match. The Zero seemed unbeatable because, in early 1942, it was unbeatable given the tactics and aircraft available to American forces. But American naval aviation possessed something the Japanese did not: the ability to learn from defeat, adapt tactics, and most importantly, the industrial capacity to design and mass-produce aircraft that could match or exceed anything Japan fielded. The F6F Hellcat, which would dominate the skies over the Philippine Sea in June 1944, represented the culmination of those advantages. Its development story was one of parallel evolution, timely intelligence, and engineering brilliance applied under wartime urgency. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island had begun developing the F6F in mid-1941, even before Pearl Harbor, recognizing that the F4F Wildcat, while rugged and reliable, lacked the performance needed for modern air combat. The early F6F design was essentially a larger, more powerful Wildcat, planned around a 1700 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine. It was a solid design, but incremental. Then combat reports from the Pacific began arriving, describing the Zero's capabilities in terrifying detail. Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, fresh from combat operations where he had single-handedly defended the carrier Lexington against Japanese bombers, earning the Medal of Honor, visited Grumman in April 1942. His message to the engineers was blunt. The Zero was faster than intelligence estimated, climbed impossibly well, and turned inside the Wildcat with ease. American fighters needed more power, better climb rate, and crucially, better visibility for the pilot. O'Hare's exact words to President Roosevelt, delivered the day before his Grumman visit, captured what naval aviation desperately needed: a plane that will go upstairs faster. The Bureau of Aeronautics made a critical decision in late April 1942, directing Grumman to install a more powerful engine in the second F6F prototype. The Wright Cyclone was abandoned in favor of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower. This represented a 50% increase in power over the original design, and required strengthening the entire airframe to handle the additional stress. It meant delays, but the performance gains would transform the aircraft. Then, in July 1942, an extraordinary piece of intelligence fell into American hands. A nearly intact Mitsubishi Zero, captured after crash landing in the Aleutian Islands following the Battle of Midway, was recovered, restored to flying condition, and extensively tested by Navy pilots. The Akutan Zero, as it became known, revealed secrets that would reshape American fighter tactics and influence the final F6F design decisions. Test pilots discovered that while the Zero was extraordinarily maneuverable at low speeds, it had critical weaknesses. Above 200 knots, approximately 230 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons became heavy and unresponsive, making high-speed rolls difficult or impossible. The fabric-covered control surfaces ballooned with air pressure, requiring enormous stick force to overcome. American fighters with metal-covered control surfaces and hydraulic boost systems maintained full control authority at all speeds. During negative acceleration maneuvers, pushing the stick forward sharply to induce negative gravitational forces, the Zero's float-type carburetor could not maintain fuel flow. The engine would cough and die, leaving the Zero a powerless glider for several seconds until positive acceleration resumed. The Zero's lightweight construction, achieved by eliminating pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, meant it could not withstand battle damage. Hits that would merely damage an American fighter often proved fatal to the Zero. These discoveries arrived at precisely the right moment in the F6F's development. The basic design was set, the engine selected, prototypes flying, but production had not yet begun. Changes could still be incorporated relatively easily. Grumman engineers studied the Zero data with intense focus, ensuring their fighter would exploit every weakness the captured aircraft revealed. The F6F's wings were designed for high-speed performance, using hydraulically boosted, metal-covered ailerons that ensured full control authority at all speeds. This directly addressed the high-speed aileron problem discovered in the Zero. An F6F pilot could roll effectively at speeds where the Zero's controls locked up. The F6F's fuel system used a pressure carburetor rather than the float type in the Zero, ensuring the engine continued running under negative acceleration. An F6F pilot could dive away from a pursuing Zero without his engine quitting at the crucial moment. The F6F structure was designed to handle 9 times the force of gravity positive and 6 times negative, far exceeding Zero structural limits. F6F pilots could use aggressive maneuvers without fear of structural failure. The armament package was increased to 6 50-caliber machine guns, and later versions offered 2 20mm cannons and 4 50-caliber guns. Concentrated firepower could destroy the lightly built Zero with short bursts, while the F6F's armored structure absorbed return fire. Perhaps most importantly, the F6F was designed to be easy to fly, specifically to be operated by relatively inexperienced pilots fresh From training. Grumman recognized that wartime expansion would flood the fleet with newly minted aviators. The F6F had no bad habits, no tricky characteristics that could kill an unwary pilot. It was stable, predictable, and forgiving of mistakes. This design philosophy stood in stark contrast to the Zero, which demanded constant attention and punished pilot error severely. The first production F6F3 made its maiden flight on October 3, 1942. Production ramped up with astonishing speed. Grumman built a new factory at Bethpage specifically for F6F production, with aircraft, rolling off the line before the factory buildings were even completed. At peak production in 1944, Grumman produced 644 Hellcats in a single month, one aircraft every hour, a production rate that stunned observers. Each F6F required approximately 20,000 individual parts sourced from hundreds of subcontractors, yet Grumman coordinated this industrial symphony with unprecedented efficiency. The F6F made its combat debut on August 31, 1943, when aircraft from Fighting Squadrons 5 and 9 attacked Marcus Island. The results were immediately promising. No Japanese fighters managed to get airborne, and in subsequent engagements over the following months, the F6F began demonstrating clear superiority over the Zero. By early 1944, the Hellcat equipped 15 carrier fighter squadrons and was 90, rapidly becoming the dominant American naval fighter in the Pacific. But the Japanese had not stood still during those 2 years. While American industry churned out thousands of new aircraft and trained tens of thousands of new pilots, Japan struggled with resource shortages, production, bottlenecks, and a training pipeline that could not keep pace with combat losses. The Zero remained Japan's primary fighter, but the pilots flying them in mid-1944 were markedly different from the veterans who had dominated Pacific skies in 1942. Japanese naval aviation had suffered catastrophic losses at Midway in June 1942, where 4 fleet carriers and their entire air groups were destroyed in a single day. The experienced pilots who had trained on carriers for years, who had combat experience in China, who knew their aircraft and tactics intimately, died in those battles or in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign that followed. By 1944, Japanese pilot training had been drastically shortened due to fuel shortages and instructor losses. New pilots entered combat with perhaps 1/3 the flight hours. American pilots received, sometimes as little as 100 hours of total flight time. They flew aircraft that, while still formidable in the hands of experts, were increasingly outclassed by American designs and American tactics. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove decisive. The Japanese, desperate to halt the American advance across the Pacific, committed their remaining carrier strength to a single massive operation. Operation Ago was Japan's plan to destroy the American invasion fleet attacking Saipan in the Mariana Islands. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet, 9 aircraft carriers carrying 450 aircraft. It was the largest Japanese carrier force assembled since Midway, and Ozawa intended to use it to deliver a knockout blow that would cripple American naval power and force a negotiated peace. Ozawa's plan relied on Oza. Several factors he believed gave him advantage. His aircraft, particularly the Zeros, had longer range than American carrier aircraft, allowing him to strike from distances where American planes could not reach his fleet. He planned to use land-based aircraft from Guam and other Mariana Islands to supplement his carrier strikes, overwhelming American defenses with coordinated attacks from multiple directions. He assumed his pilots, even if less experienced than previous generations, retained enough skill to execute complex strike operations, and critically, he believed intelligence reports suggesting American fighters remained inferior to the Zero in combat. Every one of those assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, the American carrier force supporting the Saipan invasion. His 15 carriers, 7 large fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, embarked over 900 aircraft, including nearly 500 F6F Hellcats. The American force possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, but more importantly, it possessed tactical superiority. derived from 2 years of hard-won experience fighting Zeros. American fighter doctrine by June 1944 had evolved into a sophisticated system that maximized the F6F's strengths while negating the Zero's advantages. Pilots were trained to avoid slow-speed turning fights, unless they possessed significant altitude or numbers advantage. Instead, F6F doctrine emphasized high-speed slashing attacks, diving from altitude to build speed, making a single firing pass, then zooming back to altitude before the more maneuverable Zeros could respond. The Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch even before the Zero was captured, had become standard defensive doctrine. When jumped by Zeros, F6F pilots flew in mutually supporting pairs, weaving back and forth so that any Zero pursuing one F6F immediately faced head-on fire from the other. The tactic neutralized the Zero's turning advantage by forcing Japanese pilots to either break off or face head-on engagement, where the F6F's superior firepower and protection dominated. American pilots were taught to use their speed and power to dictate engagement terms. If the tactical situation favored the F6F, engage. If not, use superior speed to disengage, reposition, and attack from advantage. The F6F's climb rate allowed it to regain altitude quickly after diving attacks. Its speed allowed escape from unfavorable situations. Its endurance allowed longer patrols and pursuit of fleeing enemies farther than Zeros could follow. Task Force 58 possessed another critical advantage that would prove decisive in the coming battle: radar. American ships carried sophisticated radar systems that could detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing ample warning to launch fighters and position them for optimal intercept. The Japanese possessed radar technology, but their sets were primitive compared to American systems, and Japanese doctrine had not fully integrated radar into fighter direction procedures. American carriers, by contrast, had developed radar-controlled fighter direction into a precise science. Fighter direction officers, sitting in darkened rooms deep inside carriers, watched radar scopes displaying the entire battle space. They could vector F6F combat air patrols directly toward incoming raids, positioning American fighters at optimal altitude and angle to intercept. The system transformed air defense from reactive scrambling to proactive positioning. Japanese pilots, accustomed to visual detection and independent action, would find themselves intercepted far from their targets by American fighters who knew exactly where they were and where they were going. The morning of June 19th, 1944, dawned clear and warm over the Philippine Sea. Task Force 58 steamed in cruising formation, carriers in the center surrounded by protective rings of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On the flight decks, F6F Hellcats sat spotted for launch, their wings folded to save space, pilots and aircrew standing by in ready rooms below. The invasion of Saipan, which had begun 4 days earlier, was proceeding on schedule, but everyone knew Japanese carriers were somewhere to the west, preparing to intervene. At 05:45 hours, radar operators aboard the battleship Alabama detected the first signs of incoming aircraft. The contacts were faint, at extreme range, but unmistakable. Large formations moving east toward the American fleet. Admiral Mitcher received the report and immediately ordered fighters launched. Within minutes, F6F Hellcats began roaring off carrier decks, climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was about to begin. Admiral Ozawa had launched his first strike at 0800 hours, 69 aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, and Jill torpedo bombers. They flew in loose formation, heading east toward what Japanese intelligence believed was an unsuspecting American fleet. The Japanese pilots were confident. Many had been told that American fighters were slow and their pilots poorly trained. Zeros, they had been assured, remained superior in combat. That confidence would last approximately 1 hour. At 0957 hours, American radar detected the first Japanese strike at 145 miles range. Fighter direction officers began vectoring combat air patrols toward the intercept. Commander McCampbell, leading A division of F6F Hellcats from Essex, received vectors putting him on a direct intercept course. He pushed his throttle forward, climbing to 25,000 feet, positioning his formation between the Japanese strike and the American fleet. Other F6F divisions were doing the same, creating a layered defense that would engage the Japanese at multiple points before they reached the carriers. At approximately 10-20 hours, McCampbell's formation spotted the Japanese strike, still 70 miles from the fleet. The enemy aircraft were in loose formation, not expecting contact this far from their target. McCampbell keyed his radio, his voice calm and professional. "Tally-ho. Many bandits below. Am engaging." He rolled inverted and dove, his division following in perfect coordination. The F6F Hellcats accelerated rapidly in the dive, building speed to nearly 400 miles per hour. The Japanese pilots, focused on their navigation and maintaining formation, did not see the Americans until it was too late. McCampbell's first burst caught a zero from directly astern, 50 caliber rounds stitching across the fuselage and wing root. The Japanese fighter shuddered, trailing smoke, then rolled inverted and fell away. McCampbell did not watch it fall. He was already pulling up, bleeding off excess speed, positioning for his next attack. Around him, the sky erupted into chaos. F6F Hellcats were diving through the Japanese formation from multiple angles, firing short, precise bursts before zooming back to altitude. The Japanese pilots, suddenly under attack far sooner than anticipated, broke formation and scattered. Some tried to turn and fight, pulling their zeros into tight spirals. But the American pilots did not follow. They had been trained specifically not to engage in turning fights. Instead, they maintained their energy advantage, climbing back to altitude, then diving again for another slashing pass. The Japanese pilots found themselves unable to bring their superior maneuverability to bear. Every time they turned to engage an American fighter, that fighter simply extended away at high speed, while another F6F dove on them from a different angle. The Americans were fighting as teams, coordinated pairs covering each other, maintaining speed and altitude advantage, refusing to fight on Japanese terms. The result was systematic slaughter. Zero after zero fell from the sky, torn apart by concentrated 50 caliber fire. The Japanese bombers, stripped of fighter protection, became easy targets. Judy dive bombers and Jill torpedo bombers, loaded with ordnance that made them slow and unmaneuverable, were massacred. Within minutes, the carefully organized Japanese strike had disintegrated into a desperate survival situation. Of the 69 aircraft in the first Japanese strike, only 27 reached the vicinity of the American fleet. Those that did found themselves facing a storm of anti-aircraft fire from 70 warships, whose gunners had been alerted and were ready. The barrage was so intense that some pilots, seeing the curtain of exploding shells and tracers, turned back without attacking. Those who pressed on accomplished nothing. Not a single bomb or torpedo hit an American ship, and one by one. Even these survivors were shot down by F6F Hellcats, patrolling over the fleet, or by the anti-aircraft fire itself. The first Japanese strike had been annihilated. 42 aircraft destroyed before reaching the fleet, most of the remaining 27 destroyed by anti-aircraft fire or fighters over the fleet. Perhaps a dozen Japanese aircraft from the first wave survived to limp back toward their carriers. Pilots stunned by the ferocity and effectiveness of American defenses, but Admiral Ozawa, operating without clear intelligence about the fate of his first strike, had already launched a second wave. At 0856 hours, 128 aircraft took off from Japanese carriers, the largest single strike launched that day. Zeros, Judys, Jills, and Vals, the older dive bombers that were supposed to have been retired but were pressed into service due to aircraft shortages. This massive formation flew east, pilots confident that the first strike had already begun suppressing American defenses. They were flying into an intact, fully alert defensive system that now knew exactly what to expect. American radar detected the second strike at 110 miles. Fighter direction officers calmly began vectoring fresh F6F divisions into intercept positions. Additional Hellcats were launched from carriers, ensuring continuous coverage. The system was working flawlessly. Japanese aircraft could not approach without being detected, tracked, and intercepted by American fighters who knew their exact position, altitude, and heading. The second strike fared even worse than the first. F6F Hellcats intercepted the formation at 100 miles from the fleet, attacking in waves from superior altitude. The Japanese pilots, already nervous from reports that the first strike had encountered problems, broke formation when attacked. Once scattered, they became individual targets for coordinated American attacks. The slaughter continued for over an hour as F6F divisions methodically hunted down and destroyed Japanese aircraft across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Of the 128 aircraft in the second strike, 97 were shot down before they could even attempt an attack on the American fleet. The remaining 31 that reached the fleet area were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire or prowling F6F Hellcats. Not a single American ship was damaged. The second wave had been utterly annihilated. Admiral Ozawa, still unaware of the catastrophe unfolding, launched a third strike at 1000 hours, 47 aircraft. This smaller force was intended to exploit the damage supposedly inflicted by the quarter, the first two strikes. Instead, they flew into a defensive system that had now been refined through two successful intercepts and was operating at peak efficiency. American fighters destroyed most of the third strike before it reached the fleet. The handful that survived the fighter attacks found every American ship fully alert, anti-aircraft guns tracking, ready. 7 Japanese aircraft were eventually confirmed, destroyed from this wave, with most of the rest turning back or becoming lost. Finally, at 1100 hours, Ozawa launched a fourth strike, 82 aircraft, his last, reserves. This final effort was plagued by navigation errors and fuel shortages, many aircraft becoming separated from the main formation. Some attacked American ships at Guam instead of the main fleet. Others simply disappeared, running out of fuel while searching for targets in the vast Pacific. Fewer than 30 aircraft from the fourth strike reached Task Force 58, and like their predecessors, they were systematically destroyed without inflicting damage. By early afternoon, the carnage was complete. Of the 373 Japanese aircraft launched that morning in 4 massive strikes, only 130 returned to their carriers. Over 240 aircraft had been destroyed, the vast majority by F6F Hellcats in air-to-air combat. American losses totaled 30 aircraft, many from operational accidents rather than combat, with most pilots rescued from the ocean. The kill ratio was approximately 8-1 overall, but in individual engagements, it was often far higher. Some F6F divisions reported kills without loss. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating. They had been told American fighters were inferior, that their training was inadequate, that the zero remained supreme. Instead, they had encountered a defensive system so effective, tactics so refined, and aircraft so superior that their attacks had been reduced to futile gestures. The confident Japanese naval aviators who had launched that morning returned, shattered and demoralized, to report that everything they had been told was wrong. The Americans were not inferior. They were overwhelmingly, crushingly superior. The 11 minutes that defined the battle occurred during the first major intercept, when Commander McCampbell's division and multiple other F6F formations engaged the lead elements of the first Japanese strike between 10:20 and 10:31 hours. In that brief window, 72 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in the most concentrated aerial slaughter in naval history. The engagement demonstrated everything the F6F Hellcat was designed to accomplish, and everything American pilots had learned about fighting Zeros. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from the carrier Lexington, experienced perhaps the most remarkable 11 minutes of his combat career that morning. Vrasiu was already an experienced pilot with 12 confirmed kills, but nothing in his previous combat had prepared him for the target-rich environment he encountered. His division, vectored by fighter direction officers, intercepted a formation of Judy dive bombers, escorted by Zeros at 20,000 feet, approximately 70 miles from the American fleet. Vrasiu rolled into his attack, diving through the Zero escort before they could react. His first burst caught a Judy square in the engine, which exploded in a spray of oil and metal fragments. He pulled up slightly, shifted his aim, and fired into a second Judy. The dive bomber's wing folded upward like paper, and the aircraft tumbled out of formation. Vrasiu did not hesitate. He had been trained to exploit every advantage, to press attacks when the enemy was vulnerable, to kill quickly and efficiently without mercy or hesitation. His third victim tried to evade, rolling inverted and diving, but the F6F followed easily, the hydraulically boosted ailerons responding crisply at high speed. Vrasiu fired a 3-second burst. The Judy's fuel tank erupted in flames, the aircraft becoming a falling comet trailing black smoke. By now, the Japanese formation had completely disintegrated. Bombers scattered in all directions, some jettisoning their bombs to gain speed, others diving for the deck trying to escape. The escorting Zeros, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, could not protect them. Vrasiu selected his fourth target, another Judy attempting to flee at low altitude. He dove after it, closing rapidly thanks to the F6F's superior speed. At 200 yards, he fired. The bomber's tail section separated from the fuselage, the aircraft cartwheeling into the ocean. Vrasiu was now alone, separated from his division in the chaos of combat, but he was not concerned. The F6F gave him confidence. He had fuel, ammunition, and an aircraft that could outperform anything Japan could put against him. He spotted another group of Japanese bombers lower down, heading toward the fleet. He dove after them, building speed to over 350 miles per hour. His fifth kill came at close range, a Judy that exploded so violently that Vrasiu had to fly through the debris field, oil spattering his windscreen. His sixth victim tried to turn and fight, a fatal mistake. Vrasiu simply extended away at high speed, climbed, and came back with an energy advantage that made the engagement one-sided. The Judy fell in flames. In the span of 8 minutes, Lieutenant Vrasiu had destroyed 6 Japanese aircraft without taking a single hit. He returned to Lexington with his ammunition exhausted, his fuel low, and his gun camera footage showing the most concentrated killing spree of the battle. When he landed, flight deck crews mobbed him, counting his kills on their fingers, shouting and cheering. Vrasiu climbed from his cockpit, adrenaline still coursing through his veins, and held up 6 fingers for the assembled crews. His photo, grinning and showing 6 fingers, would become one of the most iconic images of the Pacific War. But Vrasiu's achievement, remarkable as it was, represented only a small fraction of the slaughter occurring across hundreds of square miles of Philippine Sea airspace. Other F6F pilots were having similar success. Ensign Wilbur Spiderweb shot down 4 Japanese aircraft in his first combat engagement. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer destroyed 5. Lieutenant Commander Evan Pete Orand accounted for 4. The pattern repeated across Task Force 58. Experienced pilots and novices alike found that the combination of superior aircraft, superior tactics, and superior tactical coordination created a killing environment where Japanese aircraft had virtually no chance of survival. The 11-minute period of maximum destruction occurred because multiple factors converged perfectly. American radar had detected the Japanese strikes early, allowing F6F Hellcats to be positioned at optimal altitude and angle for intercept. Fighter direction officers had vectored multiple divisions to converge on the Japanese formations, simultaneously, ensuring the attackers were overwhelmed from multiple directions. The F6F pilots used their speed and energy advantages to dictate engagement terms, refusing to fight in the turning battles where Zeros excelled. Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced and poorly trained, made tactical errors that veteran pilots would have avoided. They broke formation when attacked, abandoning the mutual support that might have given them a chance. They attempted to turn and fight, playing into American strengths. They did not coordinate their defensive efforts, allowing American fighters to attack individual aircraft without interference. The result was systematic destruction on a scale that shocked even the American pilots inflicting it. Commander McCampbell, who shot down 7 Japanese aircraft that day to become the Navy's top ace, later described the engagement as unlike anything in his previous experience. "They just kept coming," he said, "and we just kept shooting them down. There was no challenge to it, no real fight. They were completely outmatched." The Japanese pilots who survived the gauntlet of F6F Hellcats and reached the American fleet found no relief. 70 warships opened fire simultaneously, creating a barrage so dense that the sky itself seemed to turn black with exploding shells and tracers. Japanese pilots described flying through walls of steel, where evasive maneuvers meant nothing because there was no clear sky to maneuver into. Some simply turned back, unwilling to press attacks through the inferno. Others, more determined or more fatalistic, continued their runs and were destroyed before releasing their weapons. Those few who managed to drop bombs or launch torpedoes found their weapons ineffective, evasive. Maneuvers by American ships, combined with the poor training of Japanese pilots, meant most bombs and torpedoes missed by wide margins. The few that came close were avoided with practiced ease by American captains who had been dodging Japanese attacks for 3 years. By early afternoon, the scale of the catastrophe became apparent even to Admiral Ozawa. Radio reports from surviving pilots painted a picture of devastating losses and failed attacks. The mobile fleet's carefully hoarded air groups, rebuilt over months with aircraft and pilots Japan could not afford to lose, had been annihilated in a single morning. Ozawa had launched 373 aircraft, only 130 returned. The others, over 240 planes and their crews, were gone. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to both sides. Japanese carrier Aviation, which had dominated the Pacific in 1942 and early 1943, had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. The experienced pilots who had survived Midway and the Solomons were now mostly dead. The aircraft that had been carefully preserved for the decisive battle were at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The training pipeline that might have rebuilt the air groups was crippled by fuel shortages and instructor losses. Japanese naval aviation would never recover from this single day. For the Americans, the Battle of the Philippine Sea validated everything they had built over the previous 2 years. The F6F Hellcat had performed exactly as designed, dominating zeros in every engagement. The tactical doctrines, developed from studying captured aircraft and analyzing combat reports, had proven devastatingly effective. The industrial capacity that allowed America to field 15 carriers and over 900 aircraft had overwhelmed Japanese forces that simply could not match such numbers. And perhaps most importantly, the training system that produced thousands of competent pilots annually had created a pilot corps that could exploit every advantage. The kill ratio from June 19th, 1944, told the story in stark numerical terms. American fighters destroyed over 240 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own, the ratio of approximately 8-1 overall, and much higher in specific engagements, represented the culmination of technological superiority, tactical excellence, and numerical advantage working in perfect harmony. It was a massacre dressed in the language of battle statistics. The Japanese gave the engagement a different name. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, though the term was actually coined by American pilots who compared the one-sided slaughter to shooting turkeys on a farm. The name stuck because it captured the essential character of the battle. This was not a fight between equals. It was systematic destruction of an outmatched enemy. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots created what American intelligence termed zero fatigue, a recognition that engaging F6F Hellcats was likely fatal. Japanese pilots increasingly avoided combat when possible, diving away or fleeing into clouds rather than fighting. Some refused to launch on offensive missions, claiming mechanical problems. Others, when ordered to attack American carriers, would fly out to sea, jettison their ordnance, and return claiming they could not find the enemy. The fighting spirit that had characterized Japanese naval aviation in 1942 had been broken. not by propaganda or exhortation, but by the brutal reality of combat against superior opposition. The contrast with early war engagements was absolute. In 1942, American pilots had fled from Zeros whenever possible, recognizing they were outmatched. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots were fleeing from Hellcats for the same reason. The transformation was complete, built on the foundation of lessons learned from captured aircraft, engineering excellence that produced superior fighters, and tactical doctrines that exploited every advantage. The F6F Hellcat would go on to compile the most dominant combat record of any American fighter in World War II. By war's end, Hellcats were credited with destroying 5,163 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat in the Pacific, with only 270 F6F Hellcats lost in air-to-air combat. The overall kill ratio of 19-1 represented sustained superiority across 3 years of combat. Against Zeros specifically, the ratio was 13-1. These numbers reflected not just superior aircraft, but the entire system of tactics, training, and industrial production that supported F6F operations. The F6F produced more fighter aces than any other Allied aircraft of World War II. Over 300 Navy pilots achieved ace status flying Hellcats, including Commander David McCampbell, who scored all 34 of his victories in F6F fighters. The aircraft's combat record was so dominant that by late 1944, American carrier groups operated with near impunity, knowing Japanese air opposition would be minimal and ineffective. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot marked the moment when American naval aviation achieved absolute air superiority in the Pacific. After June 19, 1944, Japanese carriers would launch no more major strikes against American forces. The few times Japanese carrier aircraft attempted operations, they were destroyed with the same ease demonstrated at the Philippine Sea. Japanese naval aviation had been reduced to irrelevance, unable to challenge American operations, unable to protect Japanese-held territory, unable to influence the outcome of battles. The final chapter of Japan's carrier warfare capability had been written in the skies over the Philippine Sea in 11 minutes of sustained slaughter. The story of how Japanese commanders laughed at slow Hellcats, then watched 72 Zeros fall in 11 minutes, demonstrates a fundamental truth about warfare. Confidence without foundation is delusion. The Japanese High Command, operating on outdated intelligence and wishful thinking, convinced themselves that American fighters remained inferior and American pilots poorly trained. They dismissed reports suggesting otherwise as exaggeration or propaganda. They launched Operation Ago, believing they possessed qualitative superiority that would compensate for numerical inferiority. Every one of those assumptions proved fatally wrong. The Americans had learned from defeat, adapted their tactics, produced superior aircraft, and trained pilots to use both effectively. They had studied captured enemy equipment, identified weaknesses, and designed systems to exploit those weaknesses ruthlessly. They had built an industrial base that could produce aircraft faster than enemies, could destroy them, and train pilots faster than combat could kill them. The result was not victory through superior courage or fighting spirit, but victory through superior preparation, superior equipment, and superior execution. The lesson resonates across military history. Technical superiority matters. Tactical innovation matters. Industrial capacity matters. Training matters. Intelligence about enemy capabilities matters. When all these factors align, as they did for American naval aviation by mid-1944, the result is not close combat or hard-fought victory, but systematic destruction of an outmatched enemy. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration that when preparation meets opportunity, warfare becomes execution. The F6F Hellcat remained in frontline service through the end of World War II, gradually supplemented but never replaced as the primary carrier fighter. After the war, Hellcats were quickly phased out, replaced by jets that flew twice as fast and climbed 3 times as quickly. The last Navy Hellcat was retired in 1954, just 9 years after the war ended. But the aircraft's legacy endured far beyond its service life. The F6F proved that careful analysis of enemy capabilities, combined with engineering excellence and sound tactical doctrine, could transform the course of a war. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot stands as perhaps the most one-sided aerial battle in history, a testament to what happens when superior forces meet inferior opposition, prepared to fight the last war rather than the current one. 72 aircraft destroyed in 11 minutes, over 240 destroyed in a single day. The myth of zero invincibility, already crumbling, shattered completely. Japanese naval aviation, once the most feared air arm in the Pacific, reduced to impotence, and the F6F Hellcat, dismissed by Japanese commanders as slow and inferior, proven to be the weapon that achieved air dominance and helped win the Pacific War. The young Japanese pilots who died over the Philippine Sea on June 19th, 1944, had been told they flew superior aircraft piloted by superior men fighting for a superior cause. They discovered, in the final moments of their lives, that none of those things were true. The Americans had built a better fighter, developed better tactics, and trained better pilots. The result was not close combat or heroic resistance, but slaughter on an industrial scale. War, in the end, is decided not by belief or propaganda, but by the hard mathematics of capability and preparation. On that June morning in 1944, the mathematics were overwhelmingly, crushingly, decisively in America's favor. The 11 minutes that defined the battle occurred during the intercept of the second Japanese strike, when coordinated F6F attacks achieved what pilots would later describe as the most concentrated aerial slaughter they had ever witnessed. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu, flying from the carrier Lexington, encountered a formation of Judy dive bombers at 15,000 feet. They were flying in loose formation, unescorted, their zero fighter protection having been shot down or scattered by earlier F6F attacks. Vrasiu positioned himself above and behind the formation, unseen. He checked his fuel, confirmed his wingman was in position, then rolled into his attack. The Judys never knew he was there until his first burst tore into the trailing aircraft. The dive bomber exploded in midair, its bomb load detonating from the concentrated fire. Vrasiu pulled up slightly, adjusted his aim, and fired again. The second Judy burst into flames and fell away. He fired a third time. Another kill. Within 6 minutes, Vrasiu had shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, his gun, camera recording each precise, methodical attack. He did not waste ammunition. He did not perform aerobatics. He simply positioned correctly, fired accurately, and moved to the next target. It was execution, not combat. When he finally returned to Lexington, his guns empty, he held up 6 fingers to the deck crew. The entire carrier erupted in cheers. Vrasiu's achievement was remarkable, but not unique that day. Across the battle space, F6F pilots were achieving multiple kills in single engagements. The combination of superior positioning through radar direction, superior aircraft, performance, and superior tactics created a killing field where Japanese aircraft were simply outmatched at every level. Commander McCampbell, who would end the war as the Navy's top ace with 34 kills, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft during the day's fighting. His wingman, Ensign Roy, Rushing, got 6. Lieutenant George Carr got 5. Throughout Task Force 58, pilots were returning to carriers with multiple kill claims, some confirmed by gun camera footage, others by witness statements from other pilots. The Japanese, by contrast, were experiencing their worst day of aerial combat in the entire war. Pilots who survived described utter chaos. American fighters appearing from nowhere, attacking with devastating precision, then disappearing before they could respond. The carefully rehearsed attack plans had disintegrated within minutes of first contact. One Japanese pilot, captured after ditching near Guam, told interrogators that he had been assured American fighters could not climb above 20,000 feet due to their weight. When F6F Hellcats attacked his formation from 25,000 feet, diving with speed he could not match, he realized everything he had been taught was propaganda. Another survivor described watching Zero's attempt to turn fight with F6F Hellcats, only to have the American fighters refuse engagement, simply extending away at high speed, while other Hellcats dove on the Zeros from above. "It was tactics we could not counter," he said. "They fought as teams, we fought as individuals." The technological superiority of the F6F was complemented by tactical doctrine that maximized every advantage. American pilots that day were not trying to be heroic. They were executing a system refined through 2 years of combat, experience and analysis of captured enemy aircraft. The system worked with mechanical efficiency, grinding through Japanese formations like a machine designed for a single purpose: destruction of enemy aircraft with minimum risk to American pilots. By early afternoon, the scale of the disaster became apparent to Admiral Ozawa. Fragmentary reports from surviving pilots painted a picture of complete defeat. Entire strike groups annihilated. Not a single confirmed hit on American carriers. His own carrier decks, once crowded with aircraft, now mostly empty. The numerical advantage he thought he possessed had evaporated in a single morning. But Ozawa's troubles were only beginning. While his aircraft were being slaughtered over Task Force 58, American submarines were hunting his fleet. The submarine Albacore fired a spread of torpedoes at the carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, hitting her with a single torpedo that seemed to cause minimal damage. The carrier continued operating normally for several hours, but the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel storage tanks, and fuel vapors began spreading through the ship's ventilation systems. At 14:32 hours, a massive explosion tore through Taiho, the accumulated fuel vapors detonating with catastrophic force. The armored fleet carrier, Japan's newest and most modern, was gutted by internal explosions. She sank that evening with heavy loss of life. Earlier that afternoon, the submarine Kavala had torpedoed the carrier Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major carrier battle since. 3 torpedoes struck home, starting uncontrollable fires. Shokaku sank at 15 hours, taking most of her crew with her. In a single day, Ozawa had lost 2 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. The mobile fleet, intended to deliver a decisive blow, had instead been decisively defeated without inflicting meaningful damage on the enemy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued into the next day as Admiral Mitcher, with permission from Admiral Raymond Spruance, launched long-range strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. These attacks, flown at extreme range requiring night carrier landings on return, resulted in additional Japanese losses, including the carrier Hio sunk and several other ships damaged. But the decisive action had already occurred on June 19th. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots immediately dubbed it, had broken Japanese naval aviation. The strategic impact was profound and permanent. Japan had entered the battle with approximately 430 carrier-based aircraft and pilots. After June 19th and 20th, fewer than 100 aircraft and pilots remained. The carrier air groups painstakingly rebuilt after Midway were annihilated. The training pipeline that produced new pilots could not compensate for losses at this scale. Japanese carrier aviation would never recover. From June 1944 forward, Japanese carriers operated with skeleton air groups or none at all, reduced to using their ships as decoys, while land-based aircraft attempted to provide support. The veteran pilots who survived the Philippine Sea returned to Japan, shattered, describing American air superiority so complete that further carrier operations seemed suicidal. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility, already fading, died completely over the Philippine Sea. For American naval aviation, the battle validated every design decision, every tactical innovation, and every hour of training invested since Pearl Harbor. The F6F Hellcat had performed exactly as designed, dominating the Zero in every combat parameter that mattered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pilots who flew the Hellcat that day understood they were operating a weapon system optimized for their success. The aircraft was fast enough to engage or disengage at will, powerful enough to climb quickly, armed heavily enough to destroy targets with short bursts, and protected well enough to absorb damage and bring pilots home. Combined with radar direction that positioned them perfectly for intercepts and tactical doctrine that exploited every enemy weakness, the F6F became the instrument of Japanese naval aviation's destruction. The 11-minute period during the second strike intercept, when 72 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, represented the pinnacle of this system's effectiveness. Multiple F6F divisions attacking simultaneously from optimal positions, coordinated by radio, supported by radar vectors, executing tactics refined through years of analysis and training. The Japanese pilots never had a chance. They were fighting with outdated tactics, insufficient training, and aircraft that, while still capable in expert hands, could not overcome the systematic disadvantages they faced. One Japanese survivor later wrote that fighting American carriers in 1944 felt like attacking a fortress. The radar saw us before we saw them. Their fighters appeared at perfect altitude and angle. When we tried to fight, they refused. When we tried to escape, they pursued. There was no way to win. That assessment captured the reality of June 19th, 1944. The battle was not close. It was not dramatic in the sense of evenly matched opponents fighting to exhaustion. It was systematic destruction of an outmatched force by an opponent operating at peak efficiency. The turkey shoot metaphor, though crude, was accurate. American pilots that day were not engaged in desperate combat. They were executing enemy aircraft with clinical precision. The Japanese commanders, who had laughed at intelligence describing the Hellcat as superior to the Zero, learned the consequences of dismissing enemy capabilities. Their pilots paid the price for that arrogance. The 72 aircraft destroyed in 11 minutes represented not just machines, but trained pilots, each requiring years of training Japan could no longer afford. The industrial dimension of the battle was equally stark. The 240-plus Japanese aircraft destroyed on June 19th represented a significant fraction of Japan's remaining naval aviation strength. Replacing them would require months of production at factories already struggling with resource shortages and bombing raids. Replacing the pilots would require even longer, if it could be done at all. America, by contrast, lost 30 aircraft that day and had them replaced within days. Grumman's factories were producing Hellcats at the rate of 1 per hour. The pilot training pipeline was producing thousands of new aviators annually. Task Force 58 could absorb losses at multiples of what it actually suffered and continue operating at full effectiveness. This industrial asymmetry, combined with tactical and technological superiority, created a situation where Japanese defeat was not just likely, but mathematically inevitable. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that American naval power had reached a level where Japan simply could not compete. The strategic implications rippled throughout the Pacific War. With Japanese carrier aviation effectively destroyed, American carriers could operate with near impunity, supporting amphibious operations across the Pacific. The invasions of Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would proceed with massive carrier air support, facing only diminishing land-based resistance. The Japanese, recognizing they could not defeat American carriers conventionally, would resort to kamikaze attacks, suicide tactics born of desperation. But even those would prove insufficient against American numerical superiority and defensive capabilities. For the F6F Hellcat, the Philippine Sea was the defining moment. The aircraft would continue serving, through the war's end, compiling a final record of over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, with a kill ratio exceeding 19-1. But June 19th, 1944, represented the single most devastating display of the Hellcat's dominance. On that day, everything the aircraft was designed to do, every tactical innovation developed to employ it, and every lesson learned from studying captured Zeros, came together in perfect execution. The Japanese commanders who had dismissed intelligence about American aircraft and pilot quality faced a reckoning they could not escape. Their confident predictions that Zeros would dominate American fighters were revealed as fatal delusions. The laughter they had shared over reports of slow, clumsy Hellcats died in the wreckage of 240 aircraft and the loss of their naval aviation dominance. The pilots of Task Force 58, many of them young men barely out of training, had achieved what would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. They had not just defeated Japanese naval aviation, they had annihilated it. And they had done so with systematic efficiency that owed nothing to luck and everything to superior preparation, superior equipment, and superior tactics. The 11 minutes that saw 72 Japanese aircraft fall from the sky was not an anomaly. It was the logical result of 2 years of American naval aviation, learning, adapting, and building the tools necessary for victory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not just a battle, it was a demonstration that the transformation of American naval power was complete and irreversible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen. Now, and don't forget to subscribe.